Good morning and welcome to this webinar from ITT Hub. A month ago, we asked a distinguished panel this question: how do fleet operators innovate to reach net zero? Our part one webinar was a lively discussion covering the importance of data, the removal of regulatory obstacles, the need for collaboration and informed decision making to rebuild the economy. Now we're back with the same question for a completely different panel of experts from three quite different fields. Let me first introduce the speakers. Lorna McAteer is Fleet Manager at National Grid, where she's converting a large part of their 3,000 strong fleet to pure electric. Lorna recently won the Barbara Cox Woman of the Year Award, which honours women who demonstrate a commitment to innovation, leadership or community. So congratulations, Lorna. Scott Pearson is the Managing Director of Newport Transport, and he's worked in the bus industry for over 20 years. Scott just recently ordered an additional 16 Yutong electric buses from Pelican Bus and Coach, bringing the number of fully electric zero-emission buses at Newport Bus to 32, which is 1/3 of the fleet. And Chris Chandler, Principal Consultant, Fleet Consultancy at Lex Autolease. Chris has been a fleet management consultant for over 22 years with a strong focus on environmental fleet management and vehicle technologies. At Lex Autolease, Chris works closely with customers developing their environmental strategies. In 2017, Green Fleet awarded Lex Autolease Green Leasing Company of the Year. So throughout this session this morning, we'll be together for an hour and we encourage you to ask questions and make comments about what you're hearing. Now, we will respond during the Q&A session, which comes later, but you don't have to wait until then. Send in your questions and comments at any time and we'll pick them up as we progress. Now, firstly, we and the panel would like to know some things about you. So to start off with, we'd just like to ask you a couple of questions. This is so our panel knows the makeup of our audience. So on screen, we would now just ask you to answer the following question. Which transport sector do you operate in mainly? Just one. Which transport sector do you mainly operate in? So we just ask you to vote for that. That just helps us understand our audience. And you see, if we know which industry you're from, it gives us some really good insight and it also helps shape our conversation. For your interest, last time we were together in our first session, part one, our biggest audience was from van, then truck, and then bus and coach. But it was fairly even, 27% for van, 20% for truck, and 22% for bus and coach. So we can see today we've got quite a big bus and coach sector here. According to my screen, we've got over 40% from bus and coach, 25% from truck. There we go. That's good. So the poll button is on the bottom right of your screen if you are. There we are. That's good. So now we're going to move to our next question. Our next question is, when do you expect your first zero-emission vehicles to be introduced in your fleet? So again, the poll at the bottom right, the answers are either you already have them within 1 year, so that's this year and next year, within 2 to 3 years, so from 2023 onwards, within 5 years, 2026 onwards, and over 5 years from 2027. Just tell us when you expect your first zero-emission vehicles to land in your fleet. It's really interesting for us just to understand again in the audience what stage you're at in terms of the introduction of zero-emission vehicles. Some companies are waiting to see if they get cheaper. Some organisations are getting on with it very quickly to promote their green agenda. Last time we were together, 32% of the audience already had them. 19% were going to introduce them within a year, 30% within 2 to 3 years, and only 19% thinking over 5 years. So within 1 year, we've got 40%. I already have them, 30%. Within 2 to 3 years, 25%. That's interesting. That's really helpful. Thank you very much indeed. Sorry to get you all to do some work right at the start of this webinar, but that's super useful for all of our panelists. So let's make a bit of a start now with our first question. And I'm going to take the first question to Lorna. And so Lorna, I wonder if you might just tell us what's the greatest challenge at National Grid for zero emission and how did you overcome it?
Hi, Leon, and hello, everyone else. What a great question. Sounds easy. I think the greatest challenge is actually the pace of change. If you think about it, it's keeping up with everything else. So whilst it's one of the biggest advantages we've got, it's actually a big challenge, because when you're talking to your executives and you're trying to get change put in place, when that's moving on you, and if you think, I joined Grid in August of 2019. I was trying to put my strategy together. And at that point in time, the ban on the sale of vans was 2035. And of course, that moved forward to 2030. So it's adjusting everything you're doing there. So you need to keep one eye on what's happening outside, where you think it's going, and try and stay one step ahead of the curve. So those challenges were there. And I think coupled with that, because of that pace of change, it leads you into all the other challenges you have. Those challenges being how you communicate that to everybody, how you get that message across, how you keep educating people as that moves forward, how you keep pace with the financing for it, how you keep pace with the technology coming out on the vehicles as well, and how you move forward and at the same time get your infrastructure in place to support taking in the vehicles that you need to do. So pace of change is the biggest challenge.
That's interesting, Laura. And did you find your customers and your stakeholders were urging you to get on with this? Because since you're National Grid, and of course you're agnostic about energy, of course, but since you're National Grid, did you find that people were thinking that you ought to be the pathfinders on this?
Yes. Is a very simple answer. And I think you've got both sides of it. Yes, because their expectation is National Grid does all of this, and not everybody understands the whole side of National Grid. So there is an expectation. You're already there and it's already in place and you need to do this. And of course, a lot of people don't understand that when you look at that holistic point of view, you can't very quickly build a tunnel under a river or across the sea. So it does take time and planning. And we've been planning this for a long time. So it's keeping up with all of that and making sure that what we do and plan to do that coincides with how fleets are. And then, of course, I've got the other hat on where I'm the fleet manager. So I'm the one with the drivers that were also putting the demand in on me saying, I want, I need, and why haven't you got it yet? So trying to educate people and show them that, yes, but 18 months ago, these vehicles weren't available. They are now, and actually in another 18 months. So it's converting everything and normalizing it. This is normal now. And how do you make it normal?
Yeah, and I was just wondering, Lorna, do your drivers sometimes take their vehicles home at night? So have you had to do something for home charging for staff as well?
They do take them home at night, and no, I haven't. I've deliberately not.
Oh, isn't that interesting? So the staff are so keen to have it. So energy's free then, is that what happens?
No, it's I've avoided giving them home chargers. So I've avoided the social discrimination that comes with the challenge of putting in home chargers. I don't give people a fuel tank at home at the moment. I don't pay for them to do that. So I'm trying to make sure all that is happening with our vehicles, it's an alternative vehicle. That is all it is. It's an alternative fueled vehicle, and it's keeping everything else within what we do the same.
A lot of that's really interesting. So you've managed that process to such a point where the staff are keen, your stakeholders are keen, and although you had to make some adjustments, it's not the big set of adjustments that people might be scared of, because you've been able to do that. That's fascinating. Thank you, Lorna.
I was just going to add on that, though, it's an illusion. There's this swan at the top. There's an awful lot of work underneath.
Okay, well, talking of swans, let's move to Scott. So, Scott, one of the things that occurs to me is that the whole climate change business, air quality and so on, doesn't respect the borders. Now, of course, we've recently had a national bus strategy, but of course that only applies to England. And we've had through the coronavirus, some differences between Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and England. Now, of course, in your case, you've got devolved decision making in Wales, and it's obviously different from the rest of UK, certainly different to England. So what's the challenges for the transport sector then? What's the challenges for the transport sector in Wales since you're a devolved area of the UK?
Good morning, Leon, and to the audience today. Is it consistency across the board, across the UK? If we had consistency of funding, consistency of supply chain, consistency of solutions, I think if we came together, we'd do things a lot quicker, a lot more joined up, and a lot more better value, I think, as well. The Welsh Government are now starting to plan better and come together. But as you said rightly, there's no borders for air pollution. There's no borders for any kind of issues that we're facing. But yet we want a devolved problem. Our 2 ULEB fundings came from DFT, not from Welsh Government. And we've been lobbying hard to try and get Welsh Government to come to the table and realise what the issues are. They are starting to, but what you then find is consistency across the board. It's just not there. So we're hoping that we can get some movement on that, Leon, and see if we can get the whole of the UK to come together, because it's just not working well enough just now. And you can see that in England with Zebra now not being a devolved issue. We then have Barnet consequential to fight for. And when that goes to devolved areas, it can go anywhere, the funding.
Well, look, I'm not going to open up the debate about devolution. Otherwise, that's a whole new webinar for another whole day. But Chris and Lorna, anything from your side on differences across the UK?
I think from my perspective, it's really what Scott said. It's about the sort of the consistency, and I think it's almost the 3 C's. I think that the governments collectively need to give sort of consistency. There needs to be good collaboration between private sector, public sector and government. And we need to have the confidence to know that there's a clear strategy to assist us in making our strategies. So to me, it's those 3 C's. And there are a lot of elements that seem to be almost working against each other.
No, that's interesting, isn't it? And Scott, maybe for the benefit of our audience, you might just explain Zebra, because that's a new term that's appropriate to bus and coach, isn't it? Would you explain some more about it for us?
Yeah, sure. England's come up with this plan now for how to put some funding into the industry in England, and they're classing it as Zebra, so zero emission for bus. There is a strategy in Wales, but because we're behind the curve on funding, we're not even near the kind of levels of funding that England are about to get through Zebra. So we want consistency. We want to have the same policies across the UK to ensure that when we're crossing borders, for instance, with bus services, we're not having to cross the same problem with funding across those same borders. So yeah, the Zebra stuff from DFT being worked on now and announced is far greater and far more advanced, I think, we've ever seen for the industry. Interesting.
That's really helpful. Thank you. That's great. Chris, in your business, one of the things that I hear when I talk to people about zero emission vehicles is, of course, they have this panic that they think that their zero emission vehicle has to be charged at home every day. So in your business, you've got a range of drive cycles, you've got a range of different sorts of requirements. So how do you deal with that as far as EVs is concerned?
Yeah, thank you, Lynn. Great question. And I think, Lorna's already touched on it, and with her approach, it's certainly there are easier approaches and more simpler approaches than others. And I think especially with cars, and we've seen a greater uptake with pure electrics with cars. We've got about 11,000 electric cars on the roads. We've got about just over 800 electric vans on the road. And I think for cars, it's been slightly easier because a lot of the uptake so far has been for company car drivers who are charging on their drive. When it comes to commercial vehicles, it's a more complex on the face of it, because you'll have drivers who may take the vehicles home. You may have return to depot vans. You may have double shifted vehicles. And so it's really looking at the right vehicle for the right application, looking at the drive cycles. We've got some customers who have engineers, and we're looking at them not charging at home as per National Grid, but where they get to a site, they'll actually be parked for quite a long time whilst they're doing engineering works. That's the opportunity to charge. If you've got parcel delivery, for instance, it's overnight or when they go back to depot to take on the next consignments. So it's really looking at the right sort of vehicle, the right sort of range, and understanding not just an overnight charge, but what the charging opportunities are throughout the day. And we've used and do use either existing telematics data, or we put in temporary data loggers on vehicles so that we can identify that. And a good example, and we did this a good few years ago, it's about 4 years ago, was with BAE Systems down at Portsmouth Naval Base, where they were looking to trial a couple of electric vans on their fleet, which was fairly tightly operated on a geographical basis. But in putting in data loggers in their existing diesel vehicles and looking at the routes, we were able to do two things. We were able to absolutely remove risk, so we could demonstrate that electric vehicles would actually work in 48 scenarios. And we also looked at heat maps on where vehicles were parked for more than 2.5 hours. And that not only told us where to put the chargers, it showed we didn't need one charger for every vehicle. We actually needed half the number of chargers to vehicles. And we're also trying to keep in with drivers' custom and practice. So we were putting the chargers where they normally park. So we're not actually asking them to change habits. And that all helps to prove and de-risk the transition to electric vehicles. And if you then look at charging networks, etc., it also allows you to put public charging networks into your considerations.
So I think there's two things out of that, isn't there, Chris? So one is behavioural, and the other one is scheduling. So on the behavioural thing, we have to overcome the fact that people and organisations have acute range anxiety and are therefore mentally geared up to keep the thing topped up at all times, which is not what you do with a fossil fuel vehicle, far from it. But also then in the scheduling, and it seems to me there's a sweet spot, isn't there? There's the efficiency for the drivers, there's the efficiency for the vehicles and the deliveries or whatever it is the vehicles are doing, and there's an efficiency for the charging. And I think you just described, didn't you, how you can steal half an hour or an hour or 2 hours worth of charging time when the vehicle is not mobile, because actually the operative is busy doing something, whether that's a delivery or works. So I think that's behavioural and scheduling. What do the other panelists think? Is that where you are?
Absolutely. It's a combination of all of those things together, isn't it? It's understanding your business, knowing what works for you, and how you go about then applying that in the best way possible. And it's that old Pareto type of rule, 80-20. You're always going to have things that don't fit the mold. And even with my strategy of having everything by 2030, I'll panic when I get to 2025 if I still haven't got some solutions for my harder to do vehicles or where those are. But right now, I've got some confidence that I can get there and achieve it because of how fast we've been moving in the last few years. So it's understand the behaviours, working out what you really need to do, taking lessons from COVID, and how people have adapted very quickly to things. We can change when we need to change. So it's educating people on it, and it's bringing them on a journey with you as well, and not panicking. It's one of the things we keep talking about. Yes, we've got these dates, we've got these targets. It doesn't all have to be done tomorrow, because it can't all be done tomorrow. It's how you plan it forward. So as you said, it's the planning, it's the behaviours, it's the cycles, and it's what can we do differently, what's within our control, and what can we change, and what can we do differently.
Interesting. And Scott, do you have the charging? Do you have charging built into your bus schedules so that at idle times they're able to be charged, or is it all just done at night?
It's all done at night, Leon, simply because we are wary of fast charging and degradation of batteries. So we've designed our schedules to fit the electric vehicles, and we're constantly looking at our whole service network to see how can we adapt better to suit the electric charging as opposed to the other way around. And you're right, it is a journey, but we have to make sure that we use what we have just now, and we do it with, and then build data to effectively bring others along with us and say, look, here's what works, here's how it's doing for us, and give others confidence to come into the marketplace, because there is a lot of fear out there that we are not ready for it yet. And by God, we are ready for it. We are doing it. So the more that get on board with this, the more that we can bring more data into the space, and then see what works. And perhaps EV is not the whole answer moving forward. That data will show us that.
Wow. So that's especially interesting for us, isn't it? Because at the moment you're able to make the product fit what you have, but actually in the future there'll be some, and as Lorna also mentioned, there will be some difficult cases to solve, and that might be a different sort of zero emission solution. It might be a different sort of behaviors, but at the moment we can't allow the perfect to get in the way of the practical. We can't just sit around at the moment and say, because the last 15 or 20% of this is going to be too difficult, we mustn't make a start. I think what you're all saying is we're making a really strong start. We don't know how to finish this job exactly, but actually by the time we get to the difficult bit at the end, we expect to be able to do that. And in fact, the very experience that we're having at the moment is hugely valuable. Is that a fair summary?
Absolutely.
It is, yeah. But the other point is we're learning as we go along. We first expected the mileage on these things, and the bus especially, to be quite a constrictor, but it's not. And we're looking at an average of 120, 130 miles per day on a single charge as an average, but we're seeing vehicles coming in and out 180 miles per day on a single charge. So we're constantly learning, and that, in effect, that data coming in gives us more confidence in the model we're doing financially is going to be sound, and the whole life cost then comes into the vehicles better.
Sure.
And on that, if you don't mind me coming in, I think that learning is at every single level. You've got your drivers that are learning, and they're self-learning as well. They're teaching themselves. They don't want to charge up all the time, so they drive better. You've then got your fleet managers are learning, and we're talking to people we've never thought we'd talk to before. And I'll be picking up the phone to Scott later because I've bought an electric bus. So, we'll be sharing lessons as you go through, and that's what we do. And then if you keep rolling it up, you're learning when you put your infrastructure in, and then you're learning on that bigger scale, because where you thought you might have to put all these rapid chargers in, actually you don't need to. So all the challenges that were there before, it's changing and shifting because we don't know all the answers yet. We're learning from it, and as long as we keep sharing from it, then we'll all progress going forward.
No, and Lorna, you reminded me of an interesting point, the debate I had with somebody just in the case of a domestic electric car, where they lived in an apartment building and said, well, there's no prospect of me charging up in my front garden. I said, well, what's your daily mileage? And they said, 20, 25 miles. Well, a typical electric car can run for a week on that basis, So this whole obsession with keeping the thing topped up all the time is something we have to face, which is interesting. So look, moving us on, and I'm going to come back to Lorna now, because we've already started to touch on this. The question for me is, what tips have you got? What good advice have you got for other fleet operators? You've already said about being brave and bold and not trying to solve all of the problems instantly. But I'm just interested in your experience, in particular, what went well, what didn't go so well, and in fact, any learnings that would be of value to our audience, perhaps mistakes or things that didn't go well on your side that you wouldn't want anybody else to repeat?
No, that's fine. I'll go with all the cliches. It's going to cost you more than you thought. It's going to take longer than you thought. And so, start planning it now kind of thing. So those are the cliche bits. But the stuff I've already touched on, as I said, control what you can control. So there's no point me worrying about some of my 4x4 vehicles today because I can't do anything about it just yet. I can talk to manufacturers, I can put my case forward, I can work with them. I can offer to prototype new stuff coming through to the marketplace, but I can't do anything today. So don't panic, just put it into your plan of when you're going to go through. So as I said, control what you can control, don't panic. Work within your normal life cycles of a vehicle replacement, because there's no point throwing out a vehicle early when you don't need to, and work out when you've got those crunch point decisions. So even on your heavy vehicles or your buses, when you're taking longer life cycles, you've got a crunch point in 2027, for example. Am I buying another diesel and running it through, or can I change to a new technology now? So it's working it out and planning. So it's setting yourself some targets, planning your way through it, controlling what you can, not panicking over it, and enjoy it. Take those little successes when you get them. All sorts of little things are exciting. I got excited this morning on my new green light bulb coming through that tells me whether the grid's clean or not. Just pat yourself on the back every time you get over one of those challenges.
Lorna, thank you for that. You did touch on something there, which is also, I think, a question for Chris. I think the jury is still out as to whether some sectors will continue to buy internal combustion engine petrol or diesel vehicles right up until they can't, in order to postpone the inevitable choices and potentially costs that they will have to face, or whether we'll be a country of early adopters. And so there is an interesting question, how does a finance company put a residual value on a new diesel vehicle? And I can tell from Chris's smile that this is not the first time he's dealt with this problem. So, Chris, words of advice from you, and maybe a prediction. Are we going to be a country of early adopters, or on the 31st of December in 2030, are we going to be rushing to the licensing office to register the last internal combustion engine fuel vehicles?
Yeah, a great question. And it's at times like this that I'm glad I don't head up our residual value committee, because you obviously have the challenge of when electric vehicles were new, because we've been running what I would call mainstream electric vehicles. So we had our first Nissan Leaf Q1 2011. So we've been running them quite a long time now. When they're new, there are a lot of unknowns. What will the second-hand market be like? I.e., will Joe Public want to buy a second-hand vehicle? How well will the technology work, et cetera, et cetera. And as we've come along that path, we've had sort of increasing confidence in this the technology. There are still question marks about the second-hand market and how the second-hand market will receive these vehicles. And at some point, electric will become the normal, and ICEs will become, for standard vehicles. I'm sure there'll always be, certain sectors of classic or performance that will run right up to the ban. But there is going to be a point somewhere along the line where the ICEs start to become less attractive, and the focus shifts completely over to EV. At the moment, I'm hopeful, looking at the global scenario at the moment, that the UK are within a group of leaders. And certainly my ambition is we continue to do that. At the moment, we've got circa 38,000 plug-in vehicles on fleet at the moment, and I think that's a good indicator to show where we are going. So residual values are still something that our business is putting a lot of focus into. But yes, it is a bit of a black art, understanding exactly where they're going to go.
I'm sure. Look, Chris, thank you very much indeed. By the way, I'm sure the audience is as fascinated as I am that there's a residual value committee. The thought just crossed my mind that they must have a fabulous Christmas party, mustn't they? Sat around in the run-up to Christmas, thinking about residual values. But it's a big thing, isn't it? Because a lot of money is made or lost on the resale value of vehicles, and a big change in technology is something that disturbs it all, which is fascinating. So there is that cost, and in fact, earlier, Scott, you were talking about whole life cost as well, because as we all know, there's two sorts of cheap. There's factory gate cheap, and there's life of the asset cheap. But I had a different question for you, Scott. And since you're a Scotsman in Wales and I'm in England, and I'm therefore out of your range, I'm struck by the fact that the government wants a thriving zero-emission vehicle manufacturing base and manufacturing support base here in the UK. And the bus strategy is full of those references to building Britain back better. But your electric buses come from China. So what's all that about?
Good question, and one that has been asked of me probably about a zillion times over the past couple of years. The straight and easy answer is, or the first part to the answer is, that we're a small operator. We're an SME, 100 plus buses. I can't afford to take new technology that's not tested and throw it into the fleet. I can't afford that. I let the big boys do that for us, and they're doing that now. So the Chinese market was very tested, We went over to China to see what they're doing. We've had a drive around on vehicles, and they clearly have got ahead of the game for us by 15, 20 years. So why shouldn't I do that? And it also gives me the ability to take a very good product, I have to say, and utilise it better without the risk of being an innovator to the maximum, if you like, and taking fleet that's still very much in new and test in the UK. That's not to say we'll not buy UK moving forward, but I'm sure that if you then look at all the fleet in the UK, how are we going to supply chain that in a short space of time? And as we talked about before, is it about you want to have all vehicles built in the UK, then expand or extend your timescales of aspiration for net zero? And if not, then we look to others to do that for us. I mean, China builds far more vehicles than we do in the UK or in Europe. I think they're about 450 vehicles a day. So why should we do that? And the quality is there, and the reliability for us has been there. So yeah, that's the main reasons.
No, it's interesting, and I am struck by the contradiction in the government's position here, because the government, on the one hand, says it wants to make the move to net zero as fast as possible, but it also says it wants to do it by building in Britain. And actually, you can't have both of those, because if you want to build it all in Britain, it'll take a very long time to do so. And on the other hand, if you want to do it as quickly as possible, then you do have to do it using the global supply chain. And there's a number of reasons to use the global supply chain, none the least of which is that the cobalt and the lithium happen to be in countries that aren't British. So, frankly, we have to have the global supply chain. We have to take advantage. And the other one, I'd be interested, Scott, on your view. I think there's another way where the UK could have a really good zero emission economy, because I'm reminded, and you're from Scotland, so you'll know this too, I'm reminded that Aberdeen became the centre for oil exploration excellence, which lasted way longer than the oil that we were actually getting out of the North Sea. So Aberdeen became a centre for oil exploration excellence, which was of itself great for the Scottish economy. So, I mean, do you think we in Britain might become a centre of excellence for zero emissions of all sorts?
I think we are, because if you look at what they're doing now with the variety of power generation just now, we are trialling various modes. So we shouldn't, and go back to the global supply chain, we ignore that at our peril. We learn the lessons from what they've done and move forward. But absolutely, why not? We are a country of innovators. We're a country of people who can do something different and new. So why not? And I think, yes. I think as Laura said earlier on, not to be scared of this, to embrace it, see what we can do and move it forward, learn the lessons of others. And the UK should, and absolutely will, I think, become that position in the global market, and rightly so.
I mean, the other thing, Scott, that I'm reminded of as we watch the vehicle manufacturers across the world make their own steps towards zero emission, we mustn't forget that, talking about China, our friends at BYD started out as a battery manufacturer. And if you had a BlackBerry or an iPhone, it almost certainly had a BYD manufactured battery in it. And so this is a battery manufacturer in China that moved into automotive. And I think that reminds us that just because there is a traditional automotive market globally, that they will not necessarily all succeed in the zero emission market, because it's perfectly possible for other people involved in technology to move into the zero emission market and be very successful. I'm just going to ask Chris, have you got any views on that? Are there the possibilities of outsiders coming in as far as vehicle manufacturing for zero emission is concerned?
I think absolutely. I mean, we've already seen one massive market disruptor in the car industry, which probably doesn't need the name to be mentioned. Everybody will know who it is. You know, they started off putting batteries into a niche British sports car, and now you know they're leading the way in electric vehicles. I think the move over to electrification does open up opportunities for a lot of other manufacturers and indeed industries, because it's very much a technology-based solution rather than sort of an engineering and emissions analysis, etc., etc. So I think it would be naive to think that we're not going to see some traditional manufacturers leave the market or become greatly reduced within the market, and new entrants come in. And of course, we're seeing electric vehicles come to market that are owned by Chinese parent companies and Indian companies at the moment. So I think there's plenty of opportunity for innovation to come from other areas as well, from industry.
Thanks, Chris. I was also fascinated, just been in the news just recently, of course, the bad press Tesla got for a single fatality of a vehicle in the United States recently. And it's also true that the vehicle wasn't in autopilot mode, and also true the vehicle couldn't be in autopilot mode. That single fatality has got a huge amount of news coverage on a day when 102 other people were killed in the United States of America using ordinary vehicles. And it is interesting how the media will highlight on zero emission, on autonomous, and a whole series of areas that the media will seize on the occasional problem. And of course, any death is one too many, and it's tragic. But the fact is that in the context of things, it's not a fair representation. And I think zero emission continues to get unfair criticism, going back to Lorna's point earlier, as people manage to highlight the 10% for which there are no solutions. What are you going to do about this? So I find that I find that fascinating. And just on the question of safety, Chris, one of the things I've observed of drivers with electric vehicles generally is they appear to drive in a more passive way than they ever did with an internal combustion engine. I don't know whether they are excited about squeezing the most range out of the vehicles, but it does seem to me it's true on bus, it's certainly true on van, and it's true on some electric cars that I've been in. The driver is driving in a much more passive way, and we all have friends, don't we, and people we've worked with in a petrol or diesel vehicle where that red bit at the top of the rev counter, which is actually meant to be a warning, but for them is a target, where they just try and get up to about 7,000 RPM before changing gear. In the case of EVs, it feels to me that they are driven better. So I just wonder, Chris, do you have any evidence back from the fleet owners about the drivers, about how positive they are about electric vehicles, and whether there's any safety, accident, insurance spin-off that you know about?
Really good question, Leon, because it's always difficult to collect actual evidence on things like this. But I mean, we have noticed, and I've noticed talking to users of electric vehicles that it seems to encourage a more relaxed driving mentality, just because you're not, as you say, flying through the gears and looking at redlining it. Even though a lot of them certainly do not lack in performance. The only customer that I know that actually quantified this was a university that we supplied vehicles to. And we put electric commercials and cars in, and they saw just over a 20% reduction in accidents. And the only accidents that stayed at a similar level, so type of, were the sort of the slow sort of parking style scrapes and bumps and what have you. And I think it's really interesting, especially in the commercial vehicle space, because what we try and look at is finding early driver advocacy. So we will, when we're looking at placing electric vehicles, we will actually put some demo vehicles in front of some drivers. We'll find those who are actually enthusiastic to try the new technology or to try green technology. And if you put those in as the first run of drivers, they'll have the right mindset of, I want to make this work. I want to see how good it is. And then those good news stories start traveling throughout the business, as opposed to forcing it on people who really aren't interested. Because as you rightly pointed out, Leon, a bad news story travels at twice the speed and reaches 100 times more people than a good news story. So in getting those early advocates on board and engaged and feeling part of the process, when you then go back to Lorna's sort of 80-20 view and you start reaching that negative 20% of drivers who really aren't up for electric, a lot of their arguments have now been eradicated. So when they say, well, where can I plug it in? Well, I couldn't do this. Well, I ran out of electricity. You can say, well, you know what? All these other people are operating these vehicles perfectly well. So is the problem with the technology, or is the problem with you not adopting it correctly? And you know, that's something that we really try and build a positive environment for those early adopters, so that we avoid those. My vehicle ran out of electric halfway down an A road in the middle of the night sort of thing, from people who have actually just forgotten to plug it in or haven't done something properly. And it would be no different as if they ran out of petrol or diesel.
I mean, Chris, you make a great point there, of course, which is that if you go into a project without enough resource and enough commitment, it's going to fail because you've hardwired it to fail. So therefore, you need to go into conversion to zero emission with a good heart and a determination to succeed, and maybe select the right people at the start, which is fascinating. Thanks.
I'm taking the mickey out of a couple of my team at the moment, actually, and I'm going to embarrass them. So when they actually watch this, or if they get to watch this, they will be embarrassed now. So same vehicle, and because of COVID, we're not car sharing at the moment, so they only live about 4 miles from each other, and they both had to do a 100-mile trip. Exactly the same vehicle. One of them was made in China, one made in US, and they're having to do their trip. And it was a bit like, I'm going to show my age now, is the red car and the blue car had a race? Remember the old Miko Bar advert? It's very much like that. And one got there, and the other one got there, and they compared notes on charging, how much, and everything else. Funnily enough, one had about 100 miles left in the tank, and the other one only had about 60. The vast difference. And it's going back to the point you said about, are these drivers driving safer now? Some are driving for fun, because, you know, these cars can be fun. You can still drive them safely, but they're fun. And it goes back to the technology within the cars as well. They're designed that way. Without the gears, as Chris mentioned, it allows you to be much more refined in your driving styles. And we are seeing that in the commercials. And I mentioned it when we opened this webinar up. Some of our commercial drivers we've seen, because they don't want to charge as much, actually their driving is improving and they're moving their way forward through this. And you're seeing those behaviours kicking in. So whilst we might not have all the scientific evidence of less accidents and everything else, we are seeing subtle driver behaviour changing naturally just in what they're doing. And we're also seeing those that are still heavy with the right foot or having a bit of fun.
Lorna, thank you. Look, that's a great place to finish, because it's about enjoyment, it's about being positive, and most importantly, it's about being safe. Now, we've got questions streaming in, and have been throughout the whole session, from our fabulous audience. Just before we go to answering some of those questions, another couple of things for our audience to do themselves. We're going to use a principle called a word cloud, a clever bit of science. We're going to ask you for the words that come into your head when we ask the question. Just type in that word. The details are all there on the screen. The results form a word cloud. So words that mean similar things will be amalgamated together, and those words get bigger the more people that use them. So we're looking for the common words, and so these will appear on your screen. The clever technology, as I say, will bring it all together. So using your word cloud, what word comes into your mind that best describes the technology of choice for your operation? Please tell us the word that best describes the technology of choice for your operation. So we just ask you to do that. You can see it now starting to grow on the screen in the web cloud. As I say, it doesn't matter that you don't have to use the same word. It's what it means to you. The software is clever enough to put all that together. That is very interesting. Battery electric. There we are, battery electric leading the field, of course. Are we surprised, anybody? And thank you for green electric. And a late run there by CNG and LNG. We haven't talked about it so far today, and indeed hybrid. But there we go. Thank you very much indeed. That's really useful. We've got 26 people there now. So we've got a second one for you to do. So I'm just going to ask the team to clear that one away and move us to our second word cloud. Again, it's the same thing. Just give us the first word that jumps into your head. The question is, please tell us the word that best describes what does net zero mean to you. What does net zero mean to you? Okay, clean air. Already way in front. So this is about, for us and our children and our families, this is about clean air. Sustainability, they're making a good run. Sustainability, thanks to Lorna's green light, when the grid is clean. Sustainability. Let's not forget there's some things that are free. Solar and wind is free. It's only capturing it and converting it that's costly. Carbon neutral. Yes, good message about carbon neutral. Thank you. That's very interesting. So this is just understanding people's perception of net zero and how it means. So for some people it's about air, for some people it's about sustainability, for some people it's the route to carbon neutral. For a number of people it is all about the future. It is all about the future, because fossil fuels, another 30, 40 years maybe? Interesting. Very good. Thank you, everybody, for participating in that. That's hugely useful. So some questions for the panelists, and I'm going to go first to Chris. So this is from Emily Sharpthorne, and she says, the recent sales of British Gas's de-fleeted EV Nissan vans saw a really good uptake and strong prices. Do we think that maybe that this was influenced by the forthcoming extension of the ULEZ in London and also zero emissions rules in other cities? So can legislative changes, if you like, help support the so far unknown second-hand market for zero emission vehicles, Chris?
I wouldn't like to say exactly what happened there, but I think it's really important when we're looking at the second-hand market. And let's face it, there's lots of incentives for new vehicles, but in the second-hand market, there are a few. And I think that businesses now have got two underlying objectives. One is because sustainability is becoming front and centre for even small and local businesses with regards to being seen as being clean and green. And I think also the likes of talking about clean air zones, zero emission zones, hopefully is impacting on smaller businesses that are purchasing second-hand vehicles and having an effect. And I think the more levers that are looking at that second-hand market and that are encouraging zero and ultra low emission vehicles, has to be a good thing, because that's our next challenge. I think fleet uptake, the awareness is high, and we're seeing some really good movements in that area. But it is that second-hand market that we need to focus on too.
Thanks, Chris. Question for Lorna. Does the panel, but we're starting with Lorna, does the panel think that the government's new target announced on the 20th of April to reduce carbon emissions by 78% by 2035 is a pipe dream or really achievable? So is this government propaganda, Lorna, or can we do it?
It's with all these things, if you don't have a target, you don't aspire to actually achieve anything. So by having some targets and setting some tough targets, what I think the government are doing here is they are showing they are absolutely committed to this, and therefore the rest of us need to get on board and be absolutely committed to it as well. And I think if I put my practical head on, even if we don't achieve it, haven't we come a long way to get there? So, and we'll be ahead of everybody else at the same time. So I think you have to put different lenses on what they're trying to do and understand the rationale for trying to do it. So I absolutely applaud it. And I think if we all work together as we should be, we can't all be altruistic though, but if we all get together, we all do take the lessons we've all said before, then we can achieve it. Anything's possible. I'm forever the optimist.
Lorna, thank you. Well, let's face it, optimism has been a little bit on trial in the last year, so that's tremendous. So I've now got one for Scott, and this is from Heather Jelfs, who asks, Newport, are you going to go 100% zero emission, and when?
I don't know. Is the honest answer to that question. We've got a couple of things to overcome first. The size of our depot precludes us going fully 100% in the short term. So we're looking at how do we move and to where do we move. So if we move depot, do we move depot to where the power is? Do we move depot to where there's land for solar farms to increase our solar panel ability? So the second part to that is really technology. Does the battery side of things restrict me then longer term to do my urban routes only, but my interurban or rural routes have to be done by something else, or it's more efficient? And that's where we feel that we've started the journey on electric, but let's not get hung up about electric. What else is out there? And in 4 or 5 years' time, as I continue to build, and we should get to about 65, 70 vehicles of our fleet being electric before that choice has to be made. And as Lorna said before, let's not be scared about targets. Let's just do these things now and see where we end up in 4 or 5 years' time, and then something an easier challenge to overcome.
That's fascinating. So there's a willingness, Scott, to do this as quickly as possible, but it depends on a number of variable factors, many of which are not necessarily under your control.
Absolutely. The scalability of the fleet and the whole life costs is demonstrating to us just now that we're doing some work with our auditors, Grant Thornton, to analyse the data we're bringing in, to see where we're going to be in that sort of 4 or 5 year period as we scale up the fleet. Does the costs, as we expect them to be, getting close to or better than diesel whole life costs? Because I think that's going to be possible. But yes, we wait and see how we go. I think it's about doing what we can now, do what we can in the next 4 to 5 years, see what technology is, and reassess.
Scott, thank you. I'm going to move on because we've got loads of questions. So the next one is from Chris. It is for Chris, and it is from Susan. And Susan is asking, what are the most obvious types of commercial vehicle operation that can make the switch sooner rather than later to zero emission?
Obvious types. To be honest, I think it really depends what way you look at it, because as I've said, some can be return to base because you can charge at night, some can be charged on night. It's really, our starting point is we look at the actual vehicle in use at the moment, and the first question is that actually the right vehicle? Because sometimes we downsize vehicles because we find out vehicles are actually oversized for their need. And you know, we've downsized vehicles, which actually has made electrification a completely different question, because the smaller vehicles previously have been more affordable and have had longer ranges. So if it were me, I wouldn't actually be looking at specific sectors. I would be looking at what are the vehicles doing on a daily basis and how suitable are they for electrification. I mean, some things like parcel delivery or something that's got regularly defined routes might seem an obvious choice as an early adopter. But in fact, there are a lot of businesses out there where it might not seem immediately obvious, but when you actually look at the mileages they do, you look at the drive cycles, you know, that they fit perfectly into an electric scenario. So I wouldn't necessarily pigeonhole it into industries or sectors. I think anybody operating a fleet of vehicles should assess suitability, because, you know, as Lorna said, even if you can't make every vehicle electric, if you can make 15 to 25% electric, that's great progress.
Sure. Okay, so I think I've got what might be our final question. Chris, I'll stay with you, but then go to Scott and then go to Lorna. So this is the question that says, is the prospect of the loss of £3.8 billion a year worth of tax revenue from the sale of petrol and diesel, which will have to be transferred to something else, because that 3.8 billion doesn't just pay for roads, it pays for hospitals, it pays for schools, and it pays for aircraft carriers. That 3.8 billion is likely to come from some sort of road user charging, and that road user charging cannot completely exempt zero emission vehicles, because otherwise it won't raise any money. So it is inevitable there will be some taxation on electric vehicles. So the open question is, do you think that the government is holding off as long as it possibly can before it starts to add taxation to zero emission vehicles in order not to stunt its growth? Chris?
Very good question. The government, as Treasury, as we move away from ICEs, will be losing revenues. I think there's no doubt they'll need to get those revenues back. There's been lots of ideas about road charging, vehicle tracking, trying to put some sort of duty on electricity, etc. I think some have got merit. I think some will be very difficult. And I think it might even require Treasury, etc., to take a slightly different view, and maybe it can't get all that money back through road transport again, and maybe it should be through, other green taxation or other areas of taxation. But at the end of the day, I think most reasonable people will realise that if there's a black hole, it needs to be filled. But it's all about timing and making sure that electric vehicles are cost effective, and so that the government doesn't jump too early and stunt their transition.
Thanks, Chris. And Scott, you must be in favour of road user charging, mustn't you?
Absolutely. I was as high as you can get it, Leon, please. Yes, absolutely. But I think that we've got to balance the book somewhere at some point in time. But what price do we pay for people's health, the environment, the world that we're leaving our grandchildren to? I think we've got a responsibility now to say, okay, if we're losing that kind of revenue, where else can Treasury get it from? And ask them to be innovators, ask them to be thinking out the box about how we do things. I think we absolutely have banged on in this industry for long enough about modal shift. I think now's the time that we should be looking at it a lot closer and giving that environmental choice of bus that is green, that it is zero emission at the tailpipe, it carries more people, and use all these factors to help government move forward and to try and balance the books. But I still ask the question: what price is our children's future?
Scott, thank you. And Lorna, last word to you on this subject. 3.8 billion. You, me, and selected other taxpayers. What we're going to do?
Yes, just do it. Fill it. No, been around this for a long time, and Chris and I have been on many roundtables years ago where we've touted this, we've talked about it. It's the practicalities of getting it in place and doing it. So your question was, do I think the government are holding off as long as possible in order not to stint the change to electric? Yes. I also think this is inevitable. I also think we will do it, but it will be done in a practical way. And what we need to understand as a population, what Scott says, this is about health, this is about quality, this is about the roads. It's a pot of money. Wherever that money comes from, it comes in somewhere. So we can do it by taking off taxes elsewhere and then putting it in so it becomes a fairer per mileage. Then you can still put exemptions in so that you exempt your blue lights if you want to. But this is now about mobility in the country, whether that's people, freight, or anything. It's moving stuff from A to B. And how do we do it in a sustainable way, a clean way, an efficient way, and something we can all afford, either from our health or fiscally?
Lorna, thank you. And thank you to all of our panelists. That's the end of our questioning and answer session today, because our clock is really ticking now down. But just to say, what a fabulous discussion. Very little disagreement between our panelists, of course. We're all on the same side here. We want zero emission. We want improved health. We want sustainability. And lots of messages, I thought, today about being optimistic and not letting the perfect get in the way of the practical, and to crack on with this in the knowledge that even if we only make some improvement in the short term, all those improvements are worth having. So thank you really very much to the panel. Thank you to Lorna McAteer, Scott Pearson and Chris Chandler. I also want to thank our Smart Digital, who are our super production company led by Nat, the Farnborough International and the Binswood Media teams, and everybody who's made these events such a success. We'll be together again for another one of these webinars on Friday the 21st of May for another hour starting at 10:30. It'll be a different format because we are actually going to do this live at our socially distanced ITT Hub Exhibition Preview Day at Farnborough. So yes, we will actually be together. Won't that be fun? The title is the Transport Decarbonisation Plan. Collaboration is fundamental. It will feature panellists, including Caroline Lowe, a director at the Department for Transport, plus Lloyds Bank and Logistics UK. Please go across to the webinar page of our website, itthub.co.uk. Save the date, 21st of May. Of course, this conversation carries on across social media throughout our webinar series. ITT Hub it will be the first and best event for all these sectors. It's a real exhibition. You can really come 30th of June, 1st of July at Farnborough International. It's a short journey in the courtesy bus, the electric courtesy bus from Farnborough Station, which is an electrified railway. There's significant car parking for your electric car, and you could arrive in your private jet, but we'll keep you anonymous. All these details are across on itthub.net. If you're fed up with being locked down and locked in, you can see hundreds of exhibitors, including most of the major commercial vehicle manufacturers, data handlers, disruptors, energy providers at this fabulous venue. You can also come and see the opening and get an autograph from Major Tim Peake. So thanks very much indeed for joining us today at this webinar. It's been really exciting, really, really, really good fun and hugely informative. So I'm very grateful again to everybody involved. From ITT Hub, thank you very much. See you at Farnborough, and thank you for watching.